All right, everybody. Today we're going to do part 2 of the Cold War notes. We're going to look at the sort of overview of how the sort of period of tensions and hostilities eventually comes to an end in the late 80s, early 90s. So just kind of recap from yesterday. The first set of notes. Basically, the Cold War is essentially describing a period of time from roughly 1945 till 1990 that saw a period of elevated tensions and hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although the two sides never directly go to war with each other, they very carefully avoid that, but instead kind of play out their sort of, superiority over the other through a series of different events, whether we talked about the Berlin Wall crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race. We talked about the proxy wars in Vietnam and Korea and Afghanistan. We concluded yesterday with the idea of nuclear weapons buildup and the arms race that took place. And that kind of really ramps up in the late 1950s, but throughout the 1960s especially is when we see this ramping up of and building up of the nuclear weapons. Particularly moving forward, the Soviets continue to build, although there are going to be a series of treaties reached that are going to kind of reduce the threat of nuclear war. That's always going to be a persistent sort of fear or sort of persistent sort of backdrop to the entire 45-year period that marks the Cold War. So today let's kind of get into how it's going to eventually come to an end in 1990, 1991. And we're going to talk a lot about the two guys you see on your screen here. This is Ronald Reagan. He's going to become president of the United States from 1980 to 1988, and the period when the Cold War is beginning to wind down. And it's going to be his counterpart in the Soviet Union is going to be this year's Mikhail Gorbachev. So the Soviet Union really has only had a handful of leaders throughout its existence, or during the time period we existed, from Lenin to Stalin. There's going to be Nikita Khrushchev, there's Leonid Brezhnev, and then Mikhail Gorbachev here is going to be the guy that's the premier, as they refer to him, the leader of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War period. So basically what we see happen, kind of the Cold War is going to move along, again, throughout the 50s, 60s, with all these different events, these different hotspots, these nuclear weapons builds up. But when we get into the 1970s, this is when we're going to see a period of time when the Cold War sort of what we call cools off. Right? It cools off, the tensions, the hostilities begin to decrease, the world kind of begins to breathe a sigh of relief that perhaps nuclear war, perhaps world destruction will be avoided. And at the time when this, begins in the 1970s, Richard Nixon is the president of the United States, and Brezhnev is the premier of the Soviet Union, and they're going to hold a series of talks and meetings. And this period in the 1970s is going to be known as the Détente Period. Détente is a French word. It means relaxing. And what it refers to, détente refers to, when there's very big hostilities between two countries or two people and they finally start to cool down. We oftentimes use that word détente to describe it. So the 70s are often described as this period of détente in which the tensions and hostilities begin to relax a little bit. The fear of nuclear war is going to reduce because there's going to be a series of agreements made by the U.S. and the Soviet Unions to halt the building of new nuclear weapons. They are already banned in the 1960s the testing of weapons. And they're going to begin to start to try and set some agreements up to reduce the number of weapons, actually begin to destroy some of them. But this is going to be a very tricky accomplishment because both sides want those nuclear weapons. The fear of nuclear weapons, the one deterrent that the U.S. had to the Soviets and the Soviets had to the U.S. was knowing that they had enough to retaliate. And, the idea of an arms race, particularly a nuclear arms race, was, hey, you're never going to attack me because look at how many weapons I have. If you attack me, you're going to face the wrath of this. And if I attack you, I know I'm going to face that. And that's what I referred to yesterday as that mutually assured destruction. MAD. Both sides understood nuclear war meant assured destruction of the world. So there's going to be a series of arms treaties. You don't need to specifically know about any of them for class. But, throughout the 60s and 70s, you're going to have things like the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, where they banned testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, meaning creating explosions of them out in the atmosphere. You're going to have in the 70s the SALT agreements, Strategic Arm Limitation Talks is what SALT stands for. Begin freezing existing numbers of weapons. Then they start to set limits on what are called anti-ballistic missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. They start to set limits on the number of missiles you could have that could shoot down missiles from the other side. And then in the later 70s, there was another SALT treaty. They began to set absolute numbers. And then in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, the START treaty begins to reduce the number. So slowly but surely, we're going to begin to see the fear of that reduced. However, Things are going to change in the 1980s. The 1980s, the tensions are going to begin to get ramped back up when a very hardline conservative is elected president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. He's actually a former actor from California. He was a governor of California after being a very famous actor in the 40s and 50s. But Ronald Reagan is very, very strongly opposed to seeing the Soviets showing any sort of strength. And he becomes the United States president in 1980 after defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter, who many saw as a little bit weak on the Soviet Union. That's part of what catapults Reagan into this position. But he has this new vision, this new idea of how to end the Cold War. He is going to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Now, this is oftentimes you hear, historians and geopoliticians and political scientists, say that this is putting it too simply. But for our purposes, this is the easiest way to describe it, right? Reagan knows the Soviet Union economy is based on a command economy, which means the government is going to direct exactly what's being produced for the people of the Soviet Union. And he understands that limiting nuclear arms and weapons buildup programs in the United States, agreeing with the Soviets to do so, allows them to produce more consumer goods, allows them to create stuff that people want. I mean, everything you think, like umbrellas and clothing and washing machines and different stuff that, we don't really think twice about in a capitalist country being able to access if we need them. We can find them in stores to buy them. Under a command economy, if you're not specifically focused on consumer goods, oftentimes what will happen is the government will produce things people don't need or want, oftentimes in the form of weapons. And Reagan understands this. So his plan for bankrupting the Soviet Union is going to be to restart the arms race. Rather than reduce weapons, rebuild the U.S. military to one of its strongest points ever, because he knows the Soviet Union will have only one choice. If the U.S. ramps up our military buildup and begins dumping billions and billions of dollars into our military buildup, the Soviet Union, not wanting to look weak or fall behind in its sort of, even level of military capacity with the U.S., is going to also have to keep up, and they're going to have to invest more money into the military. And by doing so, he knows the Soviet Union economy is going to fail. Because as the Soviet government directs and commands the economy to shift from consumer goods to military buildup, the people of the country are going to begin to get very frustrated and upset. Because nobody in the country's, it makes common sense if you think about it. If you go to a store and you can't get common household goods, but you know that your government is devoting all of its resources to building up this military for this, this sort of very vague fear of war, it's going to be pretty frustrating. And Reagan gambles on the fact that the people of the Soviet Union are going to say enough is enough, and they're going to call for reforms. And that's exactly what ends up happening. When we look at this military spending in the United States, this is a little line graph. It kind of shows you, how much money is spent, in billions of dollars annually on our military and the military spending. Of course, during World War II in the 1940s, it's ramped way up because that's, at a period of time when we needed to devote a lot of resources. It goes down. It spikes again during the Korean War because we're at war. It goes down. It spikes again during the Vietnam War. Notice all three of these are wartime buildups. But then in the 1980s, there's what's referred to as the Reagan buildup. Now, the Reagan buildup is artificial. There's no war going on. We're not, currently fighting a major significant war like Vietnam or Korea or World War II. But this was intentional to force the hand of the Soviets to keep up. And then it goes down after the Cold War ends, and you'll notice it ramps up again here. And if you look at the date, in the early 2000s, this is after 2001, September 11th. This is the ramp up of the military spending due to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that happened as a subsequent reaction to 9/11. So Reagan's going to bankrupt the Soviet Union. And it works. Reagan's rival in the Soviet Union, his name is Mikhail Gorbachev. He's going to try to reform the country by easing the government roles in people's lives a little bit. People begin demanding reforms. They begin seeing what life is like outside the Soviet Union. They begin, getting very unhappy with the Soviet way of life and the communist way of life, that they're beginning to protest and demand reforms. So Gorbachev's going to enact two significant reforms in the Soviet Union. The first is called Perestroika. Perestroika was essentially a restructuring of the Soviet economy. And what Perestroika allowed was for there to be some private enterprise, some private business, some little inklings of capitalism in the communist country of the Soviet Union. The second is called glasnost. Glasnost it means openness in the Russian language, and what it meant was, rather than, basically imprisoning people for speaking out or criticizing the government or, in any way or shape or form, sort of, challenging the power of the government, glasnost, or openness, allowed people to begin openly criticizing the government. It allowed for a little bit of freedom of speech. And what Gorbachev was hoping was that by offering these reforms, economic reform and a little bit of liberal social reform, political reform, the people of the Soviet Union would ease off. But it's going to backfire on him, because basically what he did is he gave the people of the Soviet Union a taste of what the freedom is like in a democracy and in a capitalist country, and that little taste was enough to set them off in favor of a full democratic movement. So the plan backfires. The people want more of the freedom that was given to them, and as time goes on, there's going to be this major uprising against communist governments. And by 1989, November of 1989, the people of Berlin, East Berlin, Germany, are protesting in such large numbers against the East German communist government, the one that's aligned with the Soviet Union, that they have this massive rally, and it ends up with them tearing down the Berlin Wall. One of the most famous incidents in modern history. I still remember, and I was only 9 years old when the Berlin Wall came down. People came and just ripped it down, and for the first time, Eastern and Western Berliners were reunited again. Families that had been separated for almost 30 years by the wall got to reunite, and it was a symbol of the oppression of the Soviet Union communist government's control over places beginning to crumble. And beginning in 1989, one by one, the different states of the Soviet Union under their control begin demanding freedom, and it's sort of this cascading effect. And by 1990, the end of 1990, the Soviet Union is going to dissolve on December 31st, 1991. So when the world wakes up on January 1st, 1992, there is no more such thing as a Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to break up into a bunch of different countries. Over 15 different countries are going to become newly independent, not under the control of the Soviet umbrella government anymore. And that marks the end of the Cold War. So when we look at the former Soviet Union, all these different numbered areas are regions, or what are now going to be countries, that are no longer going to be under the umbrella government of the Soviet Union. The largest, of course, is Russia here, number 11. But you'll notice a lot of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, everything, Yugoslavia, down here in Turkmenistan, and all these different areas across what we often consider parts of Southwest Asia almost, are now going to be free from Soviet control. And that's going to bring about the end of the Cold War, and it's also going to set up its own particular problems, notably in places like over here with Yugoslavia, where the Yugoslavian state's going to break apart. There's going to be these wars between the Serbs and the Albanians and all these different things that go on as well as kind of a legacy of this. But so that's kind of the Cold War and how it wraps up, and that's, like I said, the last 2 days have been a very, very basic overview of the Cold War. You could spend, weeks and weeks or months even. I took a 16-week class in college on the Cold War, so, this is just barely scratching the surface. But hopefully you guys got a basic understanding of it at this point, and we'll kind of look at the legacy of it in the coming days.